introduce your question.
Thanks, Ceann Comhairle. Taoiseach, we know that Saudi Arabia has been committing war crimes in Yemen since the start of its assault on that country. It has consistently and deliberately bombed civilian targets, but just as significant is the fact that Saudi Arabia has systemically used starvation as a weapon of war in Yemen, really a tactic worthy of the Third Reich and indeed a tactic which they employed. And I suppose, given that Ireland is exporting beef and baby formula to Saudi Arabia, a country that's enacting its own hunger plan on Yemen, a country that's actively and deliberately engaging in mass murder through the systemic starvation of a population, isn't it about time that we called a halt and imposed a full trade and arms embargo?
Response?
Yeah, Ceann Comhairle, I understand that we're taking parliamentary questions 43, 49, 52 and 75 together.
Agreed. Agreed.
Is that okay? Because I have quite a long answer here, so you might...
Well, you'll get the extra minutes.
Yeah, thanks. After nearly 4 years of conflict in this extremely poor country, the lives of millions of people in Yemen are in danger and have been for many months now. In addition to the hazards of war, many have difficulties in accessing food and healthcare due to insecurity and poor humanitarian access. Millions of others are unable to pay for food and medical care even when it's available due to the collapse of the economy under the strains of conflict. This crisis in Yemen is a matter of grave concern and a solution is urgent. The United Nations plays an absolutely critical role in working towards a political solution to this conflict. Ireland and the EU regard the appointment of Special Envoy Martin Griffiths in March 2018 as a very positive move. Mr Griffiths has worked tirelessly to bring the parties together with EU support. At the very end of 2018, his efforts bore some fruit with the holding of talks in Stockholm between Yemeni parties. This meeting was the first time in 2.5 years that both the government of Yemen and the Houthi leaders came together to promote the interests of the Yemeni people. However, this is only the beginning of what may prove to be a long and painstaking process. It is expected that the next round of talks will take place in the region. Their success will be dependent on the progress made since December, and in that regard, implementation of the agreements reached in Stockholm will be critical. In December, agreement was reached on the basis for a ceasefire and troop redeployment in the port city of Hodeida, the key point of entry in Yemen for the majority of food, medicine and aid. The ceasefire is fragile and both sides have accused the other of breaches. Notwithstanding that, it is holding for the most part. What is needed now is time to allow the agreements to be implemented, the space to allow the UN-sponsored talks to continue. That does not mean that we sit back and do nothing. In fact, the UN Secretary-General has urged the international community to sustain pressure on both parties as they work together to implement the Stockholm Agreement. Careful diplomacy is required to ensure we achieve the best result for the people of Yemen. We discussed the situation in Yemen at the EU Foreign Affairs Council last week. The UN Special Envoy, Martin Griffiths, has thanked the EU for its support, saying it would not have been possible to reach agreement in Stockholm without it, including reaching out to Iran. However, as my Swedish colleague confirmed to me, what was agreed at Stockholm is fragile and needs EU support to move forward. Despite these hopeful steps, therefore, we should be under no illusion as to the gravity of the situation. After almost 4 years of conflict, the humanitarian situation on the ground remains dire, with a devastated economy and an almost complete collapse of basic public services exacerbating the crisis. Here the UN has a critical role to play in coordinating the delivery of assistance. The UN reports that the gravity of the humanitarian situation in Yemen is exacerbated by the underlying poverty of the country. Even where there is food in shops, people, as I said earlier, are unable to afford it. Humanitarian access is also a critical issue, and access across Yemen deteriorated significantly in 2018, both in government and Houthi-controlled areas. Security issues, bureaucratic impediments and delays to humanitarian movements continue to interfere with humanitarian responses. In terms of humanitarian funding, Ireland has provided almost €17.5 million in humanitarian assistance to Yemen since 2015. This includes a contribution of €5 million made to the UN Yemen Humanitarian Fund in 2018, which provides assistance in areas such as education, logistics, food security, nutrition and health. We plan to make a similar €5 million contribution to the Humanitarian Fund in 2019. The majority of Ireland's direct assistance in 2018 was channelled through the UN Humanitarian Fund for Yemen. Ireland and Saudi Arabia have a significant economic relationship, but our trade partnership does not prevent us from raising our human rights concerns through the most appropriate and effective channels. Ireland's foreign policy has always been based above all on the resolution of conflict by dialogue. In many cases, continuing our trading relationships and building on our close ties allows us greater access to key interlocutors who can influence foreign policy decisions. In relation to the question of an arms embargo, I am aware that some EU members, which do have arms industries, have decided to halt arms exports for the present to countries involved in the conflict in Yemen. A decision at EU level for a full arms embargo on any country would require the agreement of all EU member states, and there is currently no consensus at EU level on an arms embargo on Saudi Arabia or any member of that coalition. However, all EU member states have signed and ratified the 2014 Arms Trade Treaty. This treaty exists to ensure that arms sales do not fuel conflicts and to prevent arms from falling into the hands of non-state actors or terrorists. Ireland's efforts are concentrated on ensuring the effective implementation of that treaty. Let me reiterate Ireland's deep concern on this issue. The scale of need on the ground is difficult to overestimate. While Ireland is contributing what we can to the humanitarian effort, we must continue to push for a lasting political solution that will address the conflict at the heart of this extraordinary human suffering.
Tánaiste, our concern, our stern words haven't altered the fact that millions of Yemenis are in danger of death by starvation, and your response talking about poor humanitarian access, the collapse of the economy due to conflict, ignores the fact that these are not accidental byproducts, but the tactic of famine is actually not a side effect. It's a deliberate tactic by Saudi Arabia, orchestrated situation where we know from evidence given that Yemen's geography means that to destroy its farmland is something that you really have to go out of your way to do. It doesn't happen by accident. The fact that hundreds and hundreds of Yemeni fishing boats have been shot to pieces by machine gun fire from Saudi helicopters isn't a coincidence. It has to be organised. And the blockade of Hodeidah was calculatingly organised, the only port sufficient to bring in food supply from abroad, with a lot of the humanitarian aid programme was deliberately obstructed by the Saudi bombardment in that area. And isn't it about time now that we do a lot more than just stern words and talk about negotiations? We need a lot more while this deliberate tactic is leading and contributing to people's deaths.
Response. 1 minute, please.
Sorry, I don't disagree with any of that. And that is why a lot of the focus of the conversation with Martin Griffiths when we met him and got a briefing from him in Brussels was on the court of Hodeidah, or the port of Hodeidah, in terms of first of all ensuring that there wasn't a massacre there, and secondly ensuring that that port could facilitate delivery of aid and medicines and so on. So, I can assure you, Deputy, the issues in relation to Yemen have been the source of pretty intense discussion, actually at an EU level, repeatedly, and interaction with the key UN a person who's involved in trying to ensure that a ceasefire sticks this time. I think Sweden have played a very proactive and helpful role in that. and will continue to try to do that. But I do think that Ireland is most effective here by trying to be part of a collective voice from the European Union, rather than demanding to do things on our own. I just don't think that'll work.
You'll have numerous
quite frankly, and as we've discussed in this House before, Ireland doesn't have the capacity to implement trade embargoes on its own.
Deputy Wallace is supplementary.
Yeah, I have two questions.
For the two questions in one now. And you may get a supplementary.
Taoiseach, I mean, this is a war of resistance by the people of Yemen against the pillage of their country by global financial capitalism. Salah was implementing their neoliberal policies, and the people were resisting it. So he got thrown out, and it was organised to put Hadi in his place. And when he ran out of rope, he ran out of the place. And then we have the war starting in 2015. There is absolutely zero justification for the Saudi UAE bombing of Yemen and the support of 8 countries, many of them who sit around the table with you. There is no justification whatever, Taoiseach. This is ludicrous. And on the arms issue, Taoiseach, there's such a thing as an end-user certificate system, which the Saudis and the UAE were supposed to be signing, right? They're abusing it left, right and centre. The guns, arms, munitions sold to the Saudis and UAE are ending up in all kinds of groups in Yemen. They're on both sides of the conflict at this stage. And the Saudis are using Al-Qaeda, they're using ISIS to actually fight the people of Yemen, and they're arming them illegally, and there's no repercussions for them. Why isn't Europe actually addressing the fact that no international law has been broken around their use of the weapons that the US and UK and others are giving them, and France, and nothing is happening about it? And the more guns that go into Yemen, the worse everything gets. And the people, only ones losing are just the ordinary people of Yemen. It is just mindless.
Taoiseach, 1 minute.
Deputy, I think we know what the problem is. How we stop it is the issue. I mean, first of all, any country that's signed up to the Arms Trade Treaty of 2014 has a legal obligation to ensure that if you're selling arms, they don't end up in the hands of non-state actors, of which there are many in Yemen. So, I mean, that is an enforcement issue. But ultimately, I think we need to focus on the core issue here, which is how do we stop the conflict? How do we stop bombing and the targeting of people? And most importantly, how do we ensure that the ceasefire that is there at the moment, which is fragile, actually lasts, and we can build a political dialogue over time? And in the meantime, how do we get supplies of aid and medicines safely into communities that desperately need it? So that when countries like Ireland are committing millions of euros to support aid, that it actually gets to where it needs to get to. So I mean, we can talk about how we got here and what should and shouldn't have happened. I know you have strong views on that, but I think in the here and now, we have a ceasefire that's fragile. We have an agreement that comes out of Stockholm, and we need to try and make it stick.
Thank you. We'll have the first supplementary from Deputy. Well, if you want to continue, a supplementary each and one from Deputy Collins.
Yeah, Taoiseach, you say that Ireland can't do anything like this, can't kind of go on its own on a limb, and that you're actually tied to the EU. But I mean, sometimes I see European countries take separate stands sometimes. Like, for example, before this latest slow walk to a coup in Venezuela, the Spanish Prime Minister was actually backing Maduro, giving him a chance to work it out. Then, of course, the French and the Germans come in the last few days and they say, oh, if there's no elections within 10 days, we're supporting Jan Guaidó. Oh, what absolute nonsense. There was elections last year in Venezuela, and the opposition weren't in a good position to win it, so they decided to boycott it. And before the votes were counted, the countries in the EU were saying that the elections were illegitimate. There's no logic to it. I find it heartbreaking that we wouldn't stand up and say, listen, there's an elected guy in Venezuela. We're not saying he's brilliant, but he was elected. Leave it to the people of Venezuela. Let's not be interfering. It's absolute. But now it looks like we're just going to join it with the rest of them. Likewise in Yemen. I mean, how can we continue to trade with the Saudis and even discuss the notion of having sanctions or boycotts with others, which we do have?
Okay,
right?
we're going to ask
How do we justify that? We have the Israelis shooting as whaled through a fence. We have the Saudis starving the people to death, and we think it's okay to introduce sanctions against other countries and not these. Explain that to me, Taoiseach.
Daily supplementary, and then Deputy Collins.
Taoiseach, you talk about how best Ireland can be effective, but the problem is that Ireland and the EU hasn't been effective. We know that last year the UN Security Council, for example, passed a resolution condemning the starvation of civilians in wartime, and particularly on behalf of the Yemeni civilians, but they're still starving. That's the point. And they're starving as a result of deliberate, orchestrated tactics by Saudi Arabia, which has gone with a little reprimand, a verbal reprimand. And what we're saying is, if the EU, and Ireland in particular, because last time I checked I thought we were a sovereign nation, that we did have the right to make policy ourselves, would make a stand against that and say, no, we don't trade. We don't sell our beef and baby formula to war criminals who use their might to ensure that ordinary civilians die in other countries. And I think that would be far more effective, because the tactics we've used up to now, sadly, haven't worked.
Supplementary to Deputy Collins, who's indicated.
In the same vein, in relation to our diplomatic missions to states who have demonstrated very poor standards and approaches to human rights, and similarly states who we do very little trade in and with, how can the government justify the fact that Minister McGrath is going to Cuba on the St. Patrick's Day or St. Patrick's period diplomatic missions? The St. Patrick's Day diplomatic missions, as you know, are an opportunity to sell Ireland abroad, and we have traditionally gone to countries where we have made a significant impact and those where we trade with significantly. And it has been reported that this is a kind of a personal request by Minister McGrath, and then that Mexico was kind of added in along the way just to try and make it present a little bit better. So can you explain to us how can the government stand over the fact that we're sending a minister who sits at cabinet to Cuba, given all that has happened over the years, and how they approach human rights and the very little international trade we do with them?
Response to the three questions.
Well, I mean, just first of all on Yemen, I think we'd be very foolish not to follow the advice of Martin Griffiths. He is the UN Special Envoy. He is the person who certainly I've tried to take our lead from in terms of what we do and say. We've had a number of engagements with him at an EU level. The focus was very much on Stockholm before the end of last year, to try and bring the parties together, to try and get a basis for a ceasefire, to try to make sure that we avoided what many regarded as a likely slaughter in the port of Hodeida. And we're trying to make progress on that. And I think that's where the focus should be in terms of getting a political solution here. On the questions that Deputy Collins raises, Minister McGrath is going to Cuba, and he is going onto Mexico after that. I mean, the truth is, you don't cut out countries that you'd have a difference of a political perspective on. In terms of diplomatic missions. Cuba is changing. The relationship between Cuba and Ireland is improving. That doesn't mean that we agree with the political approach in Cuba on everything. We don't. But I think it is legitimate. We're visiting, I think it's 56 countries in total, if you take what all ministers are doing everywhere. A big emphasis on the EU for obvious reasons around Brexit and solidarity, but we are also increasing our presence in Latin America and South America. We're opening 2 embassies this year, one in Santiago and one in Bogota. We have a growing trade relationship with Mexico and have had good engagement with the new government.
We're going to move on.
So I think we need to be visiting a broad perspective of countries, and that's the context of Cuba being on the list.